6 years ago in Ireland, a secret mass grave for babies was discovered near a home for unmarried pregnant women, an institution run by Roman Catholic nuns. The find set off a scandal that has raised deeply disturbing questions about the fate of thousands of women and children and the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Irish state. In a special two-part investigation, correspondent LAURENCE has been in search of answers.
In the corner of an unremarkable children's playground in the Irish town of Tuam, County Galway, a small patch of land has been walled off. A patch of land with an awful secret.
That's where the babies are buried. Tiny babies up to 3 years and 4 years old.
6 years ago, local historian Corless realised that under the grass, in and around an old septic tank, lay the bodies of hundreds of babies and infants.
They didn't have coffins, they were wrapped in shrouds, and they were just left in a disused sewage tank.
That sewage tank was in the grounds of a mother and baby home run by Catholic nuns known as the Bon Secours Sisters, for women and girls who'd fallen pregnant outside of marriage. The survivors and families of those who died were horrified.
The story came out about the children found in a septic tank, and I knew immediately that was my mother's baby.
We want the bodies exhumed from there, DNA tested.
Under pressure from widespread international concern, in 2015 the Irish government set up an official commission of investigation into Ireland's mother and baby homes.
Well, this is the commission building, even though there's no sign. It doesn't look much really, but for the survivors, it represents all their hopes and their fears and their suspicions.
The commission was due to produce its final report in 2018. It has still not done so.
It's an uphill struggle the whole time to keep on top of the government, to remind them to get this started, to get this going.
Nearly 800 babies died in Tuam. But that is just part of this story. The Commission is investigating 14 of the Republic's mother and baby homes, of which 10 were run by Catholic orders. In these films, we investigate evidence that between 4,000 and 6,000 babies and infants died in their care.
The nuns knew babies were dying and they did nothing about it. It's neglecting babies to death.
And we reveal how what began as a church and state-sponsored moral crusade became a conveyor belt of institutional abuse.
I was deprived of a mother, and then they tried to deprive my children, my son, of a mother.
This is a scandal which has destroyed families, cost thousands of lives, and raised profound questions about the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Irish state.
When the British left, we got a substitute oppressor, which was the church. But the church did not do it alone. The church was aided and abetted by the state.
It all began so differently. In 1916, Ireland's heroic but doomed Easter Rising was brutally crushed by the British. But it left a hugely symbolic legacy, a proclamation which guaranteed universal suffrage and equal rights to all its citizens.
The proclamation of Irish independence There's actually quite a beautiful document that begins all Irish men and Irish women. And our equality is established from the very beginning.
But for the victims of Ireland's mother and baby homes, that promise of justice and equality was to be cruelly betrayed.
The people who took control of the mechanics of government. They were arch-conservative. They were hand in glove with the Catholic Church.
Two men came to epitomise that relationship. Prime Minister Eamon de Valera, regarded by many as the father of the modern Republic of Ireland, and Archbishop John Charles McQuaid.
McQuaid worked very closely. Well, you could almost say that de Valera, who was the Prime Minister, worked for McQuaid.
The position of the Catholic Church as the arbiter of all that was ethical, correct and moral in our society became beyond challenge. They wished to portray this island as a shining light of Catholicism.
But with no sex education allowed in schools, and contraception and abortion banned by church and state, pregnancies outside marriage were perhaps inevitable. And the solution to that was mother and baby homes.
The whole point of these institutions was to hide and contain any sexual immorality from a Catholic. Men who committed crimes against women and children weren't locked up because they weren't evidence. But the pregnant woman was evidence. The illegitimate child was evidence that people had had sex outside of marriage.
From 1922, new mother and baby homes sprung up across the country, presented to young women as a solution to their shameful sin. There were actually no such thing.
The Irish state and the Catholic Church created the most appalling misogynist state. And they did so through the architecture of containment.
That architecture of containment incorporated Ireland's notorious Magdalen laundries, where hundreds of so-called fallen women were subjected to brutal regimes of forced labour. It included the country's network of bleak industrial schools, part orphanages, part penal institutions, run by orders of nuns and brothers. And the final element, the mother and baby homes. In the near 7 decades of their existence, more than 30,000 women would pass through their doors.
So this is a map of what it was before it was the mother and baby.
That's right. You can see it here, Tuam Union Workhouse.
Right.
It's estimated there would be at least maybe 80 to 100 mothers there at a time.
Maggie O'Connor was sent to Tuam in 1937, though for most of her life she kept it secret from her daughter, Annette.
As a child, any discussion about the nuns meant Mum was in trouble. And it would be just complete trauma and stress and upset. I couldn't understand who these nuns were and what they'd done to her. As I got older then, she started to talk to me and she started to tell me about the nuns.
Maggie was just 13 when her mother, Annette's grandmother, died, leaving her to look after 7 younger brothers and sisters. Unable to cope, the children were taken away, not into care, but to court.
Mum was charged, because that's what it says, with what charged, found destitute, and sentenced to 2.5 years in Lennoboy Castle in Galway that was run by the Sisters of Mercy.
Lennoboy Castle was a particularly cruel industrial school. An inspector at the time described the children there as
emaciated, cowed, dirty and unhappy,
and said their diet had been
reduced almost to starvation level.
Maggie's life in Lennoboy was filled with suffering. When she was 17, it got worse.
She was raped by the caretaker. And she didn't tell anybody about that rape until she was 70. She was so adamant it was rape. He raped me. And she was taken. She was taken to a mother and baby home because she was pregnant outside marriage.
Maggie was moving to the next stage on the church's conveyor belt of abuse.
No matter what the situation was, it was always a woman or girl's fault. She had done something to put herself in that situation, or she had done something to lead the man on.
It happened to my mother as well. The dehumanisation, the taking away of human rights, totally destroyed.
Anna Corrigan's mother, Bridget Dolan, was also sent to Tuam, though she never told her daughter.
My mother died in 2001, and in 2012 then I decided to do some family research. They both came as damaged people. My mother from the mother and baby homes, and my father from the industrial schools.
When her father, William, was just 7, his mother had died of tuberculosis, with tragic consequences for William and his siblings.
The children were sentenced to 10 years in industrial schools. Their crime bin, their mother died.
William's sister Molly ended up in St Brigid's Industrial School for Girls, run by the Sisters of Mercy in Loughrea. Former inmates here have reported both physical and sexual abuse. When Molly was just 13, she became ill and died. There is a neat and orderly nuns' graveyard in front of the school. Molly's grave is unknown and unmarked.
Growing up, I didn't know anything about it. I knew nothing about my parents' life.
But the family's biggest secret, as Anna discovered, was that her mother had twice become pregnant before meeting her father and was sent to have her babies and do penance in Tuam.
They had to bury the secret, they had to bury this guilt. I'm still trying to process how she coped.
Ireland's architecture of containment targeted women it identified as sinful and the poor it saw as undeserving. But it stands charged with targeting another group for its ethnicity.
I'm a member of the travelling community. In my culture, the boogeyman, the cruelty man, as we call him, he was a child kidnapper. He took children, he took children away from their families, their parents.
One day in 1951, when Catherine Coffey O'Brien's mother was a small child, the cruelty man, officially a child protection officer, arrived at her family's camp and seized her and her 9 siblings.
These were children. They were all sentenced into various industrial schools.
Like so many travelling families before and since, the children were scattered in institutions across the country. Catherine's aunt died at 17 in Killarney.
We still don't know how she died.
2 of her uncles ended their days in St Finian's Mental Hospital. By the 1950s, Ireland had the highest proportion of people in mental hospitals in the world, more even than the USSR under Stalin.
My grandmother died in Carsavine, blind, in abject poverty, and never seen any of all but 2 of her children again. She didn't even know where her own daughter was buried.
Meanwhile, Catherine's traumatised mother married briefly and had Catherine. But with her mum in and out of mental institutions, Catherine was sent to a succession of industrial schools, where she experienced constant racist abuse and violence, often at the hands of nuns.
I was thrown into a bath of water and I was scrubbed within an inch of my life. Scrub the knacker for me was the term used. It's a very racist, horrible, negative term for a traveller.
Catherine did eventually escape industrial school, moved into a bedsit and fell in love. But her happiness was not to last.
Before that, I got pregnant. I found out that he had a fling with a young one, another girl. I went to the social work course, and she said to me, "There's a place in Cork you can go to," she said.
Catherine was being sent to BESSBOROUGH Mother and Baby Home, run by the Sisters of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. She was going back to an institution.
All the industrial schools, all the orphanages, the Magdalenes and the mother and baby homes, they were all interconnected. And once your family was through the system, it was almost like you had a target in your back.
At least 900 babies and infants are known to have died in BESSBOROUGH, the last in 1994. But the burial places of only 64 are recorded. The sisters, whose convent still overlooks the grounds, claim to have no idea where they buried the other 800 or more.
Is just more deny until they die. I don't believe for 1 second they don't know where the burial grounds are.
The same order of nuns ran another home, Shanross Abbey in Rosscray, Tipperary. They sold the buildings in 2018.
It is actually the first time that any film crew have been allowed inside.
Teresa Collins was born here.
Looking out the door. God, it's huge.
This is your first impression when you walk in.
It's like a stately home.
It is a beautiful house. But as you go down along, you'll see the secrets. Here. Once you're in, you're in.
9 years ago, the sisters supplied the government with death registers, which showed that 269 babies had died in Shanross Abbey between 1934 and 1967. But an examination of the town's official death records reveals a rather different figure. In reality, over 1,000 babies and infants died in the home.
Each mother came in was never called by their own name. They always had a house name.
In BESSBOROUGH, 1989, I was told to decide my name was Jane. Besides, for taking my culture from me, my family away from me, they took my name.
Their identity was taken away, their human rights was taken away, their hair was taken away, their clothes was taken away. Prisoners got better treatment.
The nuns imposed a regime of relentless, back-breaking work in the fields and indoors.
Maggie, my mother, remembers being heavily pregnant, and she remembers the length of the halls she had to scrub. That was just a never-ending job.
Every one of them was brought downstairs. As we say, out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
Now, as far as we can gather, this was the delivery suite. The reason being down here is so quiet.
There would be no pain relief allowed and no pain relief available.
The pain of childbirth would be part of your sin, an atonement if you're in pain. Tough.
You're nothing. You're dirt, right? Whispering in your ear when you're given a horrendous birth, a breech birth. Well, was it worth your 2 minutes of pleasure? Your child is spawn of the devil.
In Castle Pollard, where over 220 babies are known to have died, survivors speak of the screaming room, an outhouse where mothers in labour were taken when their cries of agony got too loud.
So the baby would be born then. She would be allowed a few days rest with the baby, but then it was back to work. And from that point, she'd only be allowed to see the baby, to breastfeed the baby. So it was just, to me, not to be crude, bringing in the cows for milking.
Mothers were usually compelled to stay in their home for a year or more, working unpaid to feed their child and in penance for their sin.
a woman has a baby out of wedlock, she commits a mortal sin. Can you imagine a mortal sin, a murderer, when they commit murder, in the eyes of the church, commits a mortal sin? You're on par with a murderer, damned to hell and hellfire.
And when their time of penance was up, they were cast out and made to leave their children behind. Julia Devaney lived with the nuns in Tuam from 1926, when she was just 8, until the home closed in 1961. And when she left, she recalled the suffering of the young mothers.
It was like Our Lady waiting for the crucifixion of God. They didn't see any future in the child, just the year, and they knew that, and sure, that was enough to break their hearts, wasn't it? Oh, it was a house of tears. It was an awful house of sorrow.
When my mother actually left, it was in the middle of the biggest snowstorm we ever had in Ireland. I have this picture of her walking down the road with her suitcase, having to leave her baby behind.
Hannah doesn't know if her mother was ever given news of John, the son she left behind. But we do have a description of him. It's from a government inspector who visited Tuam shortly afterwards.
A miserable, emaciated child with voracious appetite and no control over bodily functions. Probably mental defective.
Less than 2 months later, he was dead.
John was born normal and healthy. They starved him to death, there's no question about it. Emaciated, you're starving. Voracious appetite, you're not being fed.
The government inspector also noted that out of 66 babies born or admitted to the home in the previous 6 months, 21, nearly a third of them, had died. When Annette Mackay's mother Maggie gave birth to her daughter Mary Margaret in Tuam, it seems she tried to resist the nuns' rules.
Anybody who was cheeky or would disagree with the nuns or demand to see their child, they were the problem. So she was moved to Loughrea Industrial School.
There, in early June 1943, just 6 months after she'd given birth, a nun approached Maggie with some news about the daughter she'd left behind in Tuam.
She remembers so clearly the day, pegging out the washing. The nun came, told her the child of your sin is dead, and let her go the same day. And there would be no funeral, there would be no more sighting of the baby. For my mother, it must have just felt like the baby just disappeared.
There are no photographs of Annette's sister Mary Margaret or Anna's brother John to remember their short lives by. There is not even a record of where they were buried. But all the evidence points to that septic tank by the children's playground in Tuam. Yet despite the litany of death and neglect the inspector had found on his visit to Tuam, he concluded,
"The care given to infants in the home is good. The sisters are careful and attentive. Diets are excellent."
The nuns had got away with it. And across Ireland, with the support of the state and the church authorities, they would continue to get away with it for decades. In part 2 of our investigation into the mother and baby home scandal, we look at the fate of the babies, those who survived and those who did not.
The babies were just another commodity. That's all we were to the church.
We reveal the shocking treatment of unmarked child graves in one home, and we find dramatic new evidence about the possible location of missing babies in Bessborough.
This is a very definite area of interest. They are regular, they match what you would expect to find for an individual infant burial.
And we ask why, 5 years after the official commission of investigation was established, no one has been called to account.
They just don't want to believe that it happened on the scale it happened because it is so shameful. But the Irish state needs to accept this. This isn't going away.
We asked the religious orders named in this film to respond to the issues we've raised. Both declined to be interviewed. The Sisters of the Sacred Hearts said they were cooperating fully with the Commission of Investigation. In a brief statement they added, "We provided a service for these women. We did not create the society which contributed to such exclusion and pain." The Sisters of Bon Secours said only that they continued to cooperate with the Commission and could not comment ahead of its final report.